I sat in that mahogany-paneled conference room, the kind with leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car, and watched my younger brother Preston walk out with everything. The entire $18 million estate, the company my father built from nothing, the penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the vacation home in Aspen. 3 vintage cars I'd helped my father restore in our garage when I was a teenager, back before everything changed. Me? I got a check for $75,000 and a handwritten note that said, "I hope this helps with your retirement, James." $75,000. After 65 years of being his son. After serving 2 tours in Vietnam, while Preston stayed home and learned the business. After 40 years of showing up to every family dinner, every holiday, every obligation, even when the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. The lawyer, some guy named Richardson with silver hair and a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, slid the paperwork across the table. "Your father was very specific about the distribution of assets," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The trust was established 15 years ago and has remained unchanged since." 15 years ago. I did the math quickly. That was 2010, right after I'd retired from the Postal Service and finally admitted to myself that I'd never be the corporate executive my father had wanted me to be. Right after Preston had taken over as CEO and tripled the company's revenue in 3 years. Preston stood up, straightening his $4,000 suit. "James, I'm sure we can talk about this later. Maybe work something out." But his voice had that hollow quality to it, the same tone people use when they're saying something polite they don't mean. He'd already started gathering his copies of the will, his inheritance documents, the deed transfers. Work something out? I kept my voice level. 40 years in the military and 30 more dealing with difficult customers at the post office had taught me how to keep calm when everything inside was screaming. "What's there to work out, Preston?" Dad made his wishes pretty clear. My sister-in-law Caroline touched Preston's arm. "Honey, we should go. We have that meeting with the accountants at 3. She didn't look at me either. Nobody was looking at me. I sat there alone after they left, staring at that check. $75,000. The lawyer had packed up his briefcase and excused himself, probably relieved to be done with the awkward family drama. Through the window, I could see the Chicago skyline my father had loved, the city where he'd built his manufacturing empire from a single machine shop in 1962. The note was written in his shaky handwriting from those last months. I read it again, looking for something, anything that would explain this. "I hope this helps with your retirement, James. You made your choices. I made mine. Dad, you made your choices." That line hit me like a punch. I knew exactly what choice he was talking about. It was 1968. I was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, with a full scholarship to Northwestern University and a guaranteed spot in my father's company after graduation. My future was mapped out like a highway with no exits. But every night on the news, I watched young men my age coming home in boxes from a place called Vietnam. I watched Walter Cronkite counting casualties. I watched protest marches and flag burnings and politicians arguing about dominoes and containment. And I made a choice. I told my father over dinner on a Tuesday in April. I still remember the pot roast my mother made, the way the chandelier above the dining table cast shadows on his face when he looked up from his plate. "I enlisted," I said. "I leave for basic training in 6 weeks." My mother's fork clattered against her plate. Preston, 14 at the time, stared at me with wide eyes. But my father just set down his knife very carefully, wiped his mouth with his napkin and said, "You did what?" "I enlisted in the Army. I couldn't sit in a college classroom while other guys were dying because they didn't have deferments." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. "You threw away Northwestern," my father said finally. "You threw away your future. For what? To be a hero? To do what I thought was right?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. You want to know what's right, James? Building something, creating jobs, taking care of your family, not running off to some jungle to get yourself killed for politicians who don't give a damn about you." My mother tried to intervene. "Richard, please." "No, Margaret. Let him hear this. You want to play soldier, go ahead. But don't expect me to celebrate it." Don't expect me to wait around while you waste your potential on someone else's war. I went anyway. I served 2 tours, came home with a Purple Heart, shrapnel scars on my left leg that still ache when it rains, and memories that wake me up at 3 in the morning even now, 45 years later. I came home to a father who shook my hand like I was a stranger and never asked me a single question about where I'd been or what I'd seen. Preston had taken my spot at Northwestern. By the time I got back, he was already working at the company part-time, learning the business, becoming the son my father actually wanted. I went to community college on the GI Bill, got a degree in business administration that I never used, and ended up working for the Postal Service because they hired veterans and the pay was steady. I married Linda, a nurse I met at the VA hospital during one of my checkups. We had 2 kids, raised them in a modest house in Arlington Heights, saved for their college, lived a good, simple life, and I showed up for family dinners. Every Sunday for 40 years, unless I was working or sick. I showed up for Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. I showed up for Preston's wedding, for the birth of his 3 children, for my father's 70th birthday party, where he gave a speech thanking Preston for carrying on the family legacy and never once mentioned my name. I showed up because he was my father, and because some part of me kept hoping that one day he'd look at me and see something other than disappointment. Now, sitting in that conference room with a $75,000 check and a note about choices, I realized he never would. Because he was dead, and I'd missed my chance by about 47 years. Linda was waiting in the car. She took one look at my face and knew how bad. Preston got everything. The company, the properties, the cars, everything. And you? I showed her the check. She was quiet for a long moment, then reached over and took my hand. "We'll be okay," she said. "We've always been okay." That was true. We'd raised 2 successful kids. Our daughter Emily was a doctor in Seattle. Our son Michael taught history at a high school in Colorado. We had our house paid off, our savings, our pensions. $75,000 would be nice for travel, for spoiling the grandkids, for finally fixing that roof that leaked every spring. But it wasn't about the money. It never had been about the money. It was about that handwritten note. You made your choices. I made mine. My father had spent 40 years punishing me for going to Vietnam. That night I couldn't sleep. Linda dozed off around 11, but I stayed up, sitting in my recliner in the living room, staring at my old service photos on the wall. There was one of me and my unit, taken 3 days before the ambush that got my buddy Tommy killed and put that shrapnel in my leg. We looked so young, all of us, barely old enough to vote but old enough to carry M16s through rice paddies. I thought about my father's note. You made your choices. Damn right I did. I chose to serve my country. I chose honor over money. I chose to stand with men who became closer than brothers, who I'd have died for and who would have died for me. But that check, that $75,000 against Preston's $18 million, that wasn't just about money or property. That was my father's final statement. His last word on who I was and what my life had meant to him. And I wanted to know why. The next morning I called a lawyer. Not Richardson, the estate guy who'd handed out the inheritance. A different kind of lawyer. Her name was Sharon Martinez, and she specialized in estate disputes. Her ad in the Yellow Pages said, "Fighting for fair inheritances since 1985. Her office was in a strip mall in Schaumburg, nothing fancy, but her handshake was firm and her eyes were sharp. I laid out the whole story, showed her the will, showed her the note. "Can we contest this?" I asked. She read through everything carefully, made some notes on a legal pad. "Mr. Thornton, I'll be straight with you. Your father had every legal right to distribute his estate however he wanted. The will is clear, properly executed, witnessed correctly. Unless you can prove undue influence or mental incompetence at the time it was drafted, 15 years ago. He was 65, sharp as a tack, running a multi-million-dollar company. Then no, we can't contest the will itself." She set down her pen. "But there might be another angle." "What angle?" "You said the trust was established 15 years ago and never changed. That means there were 15 years where your father could have modified it if he'd wanted to. Did his circumstances change during that time? Did his relationship with you change?" I thought about it. We saw each other every month at family dinners. We were never close, but we weren't hostile either. It was just cold. Any conversations about the will, about inheritance, about his plans for the estate? Never. He didn't talk about that stuff. At least not to me. Sharon leaned back in her chair. Here's what I'm thinking. This note, you made your choices, I made mine. That suggests there's a story here. A reason. And sometimes, Mr. Thornton, when we dig into these family situations, we find things that change the whole picture. Letters, documents, conversations that other people remember differently. Evidence that maybe the will doesn't reflect the whole truth. You want me to investigate my own father? I want you to get answers. Whether that leads to changing the inheritance or just understanding why things happened the way they did, that's up to you. But my fee for consultation is $300. If you want me to dig deeper, we can talk about a retainer. I wrote her a check for $300. Not to fight for money, but to understand. After 40 years of cold silences and that final note, I needed to know why my father had hated my choice so much that he'd carried that anger to his grave. Sharon started with the easy stuff. She pulled public records, business filings, anything that might show financial pressure or manipulation around the time the trust was created. Nothing. My father's company had been thriving in 2010. Preston had just taken over as CEO and was making smart moves, expanding into new markets. She interviewed family, friends, people who'd known my father for decades. Most of them gave the same story. Richard Thornton was a brilliant businessman, a tough negotiator, devoted to his company and his legacy. Cold with his older son, warm with his younger one. Everyone knew it. Nobody knew exactly why, though plenty of people had theories. He never forgave James for not joining the business, said Walter Morrison, my father's old golf partner. Richard had this vision of a dynasty, both sons in the company, eventually both sons as co-CEOs. When James went to Vietnam instead, Richard took it as a personal rejection. Sharon tracked down my father's secretary from the 80s and 90s, a woman named Doris Chen, who'd retired to Florida. She was more direct. Your father used to keep a photograph of you in his desk drawer, Doris told me over the phone, in your uniform, right after boot camp. He never displayed it, but I saw it once when I was looking for something. He was just sitting there, staring at it. Did he say anything? He closed the drawer real quick when he realized I was there. But I remember his face. He looked. She paused, searching for the word. Sad. Really, really sad. That didn't match the man who'd spent 40 years treating me like an obligation. Sad didn't fit with the handwritten note about choices. 2 weeks into Sharon's investigation, she called me with something interesting. I found your father's attorney from back in 2010. Guy named Paul Stevens, just retired last year. He still had his notes from when they drafted the trust. And according to his notes, your father didn't want to leave you out entirely. The original draft had you inheriting 40% of the estate and Preston getting 60%. Your father said something like, James made his own path, but he's still my son. My heart jumped. So what changed? 2 weeks before they finalized the trust, your father came back with new instructions. Cut your inheritance down to the minimum, a token amount. Stevens noted that your father seemed under considerable stress, and that someone had been in his ear about it. Someone? Who? Stevens didn't write down the name, but he noted that your father kept mentioning she thinks it's only fair, and she's probably right. Stevens assumed it was your mother, my mother, who'd been dead for 3 years now, who'd always been the peacekeeper, the mediator, the one who tried to smooth over the tension between my father and me. She'd convinced him to cut me out? That didn't make sense. I drove out to Preston's office the next day, unannounced. The company occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building my father had dreamed about when he was starting out in that machine shop. The receptionist looked nervous when I gave my name. Mr. Thornton is in a meeting. Tell him his brother is here. Tell him I'll wait. I sat in the lobby for 45 minutes, long enough to watch employees come and go, to see the corporate photos on the wall showing my father shaking hands with mayors and senators, to notice that there wasn't a single picture of me anywhere. Not one. Preston finally came out, his smile tight and professional. "James, this is unexpected. Let's talk in my office." His office was on the top floor, corner view, bigger than my entire first floor at home. He offered me coffee. I declined. "I've been looking into Dad's will," I said. "Into why he made the decisions he made." Preston's smile faded. "James, Dad had his reasons. He built this company. He had the right to leave it to whoever he wanted. I'm not disputing that. I just want to understand. Because according to Dad's lawyer, the original plan was different. I was supposed to get 40%, but something changed 2 weeks before they finalized everything. Someone convinced him to cut me down to basically nothing. The company occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building my father had dreamed about when he was starting out in that machine shop. The receptionist looked nervous when I gave my name. "Mr. Thornton is in a meeting. Tell him his brother is here. Tell him I'll wait." I sat in the lobby for 45 minutes. We're the only family each other has left, now that Mom and Dad are gone. I'm not trying to take your inheritance. I just want the truth. "Who convinced Dad to cut me out?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed and sat down heavily in his chair. "Caroline, my sister-in-law, Preston's wife. What about her? She was worried about the company, about what would happen if you inherited a significant portion. You'd never worked here, never shown any interest. She thought you might want to sell your shares, or worse, try to get involved in management without understanding the business. She talked to Dad about it, a lot. She made a pretty convincing case that the company would be more stable if everything stayed in one set of hands. And Dad listened to her, instead of following his own instincts. Dad trusted her business judgment. She'd just gotten her MBA, she understood corporate structure. And she wasn't wrong, James. What would you have done with 40% of a manufacturing company? I don't know. Maybe we could have talked about it. Maybe I would have been fine with selling my shares back to the company at fair value. Maybe I would have just been happy to be included in my father's legacy in some way that mattered. I stood up. But we'll never know, because nobody asked me. And now, I've got $75,000 and a note about how I made my choices. James. Thanks for your time, Preston. I left before he could say anything else. In the elevator down, my hands were shaking, not with anger, with something else, a kind of bitter understanding. My father hadn't cut me out because he hated me or my choices. He'd cut me out because his daughter-in-law had convinced him I'd be bad for business, and he'd gone along with it because by 2010, after 40 years of distance between us, he didn't know me well enough to know what I'd actually want or do. The gap I'd created in 1968 when I chose Vietnam over college had grown so wide that he could believe I might damage the company he'd built, could believe I'd be just another problem to manage. That night, I told Linda everything. She listened, then said, "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know. Sharon says I might have a case for undue influence, but it's a long shot. Caroline wasn't family when the trust was created. She was just Preston's girlfriend at the time, and Dad was competent. He made his own decision. Do you want to fight it?" I thought about my father, sitting in his office, staring at my old boot camp photo in his desk drawer when nobody was looking. I thought about him at family dinners, making conversation about the weather and the bears while this ocean of unsaid things sat between us. I thought about him writing that note in his shaky handwriting. "You made your choices. I made mine." "No," I said. "I don't want to fight, but I want him to know that he was wrong. James, he's gone. I know, but Preston isn't. Caroline isn't. And maybe I'm not either." The next morning I went back to Sharon's office and told her to drop the investigation. She looked surprised. "You sure? Because I think we might actually have something here. If Caroline was Preston's girlfriend and she was pushing your father to exclude you for the benefit of her future husband, that could be argued as, I'm sure. Send me your final bill. I appreciate everything you've done." She nodded slowly. "Can I ask what changed your mind?" I realized I already got my inheritance. 45 years ago. I didn't explain what I meant. I just paid her bill and drove home. That weekend, I pulled out my old footlocker from the basement, the one I'd packed away after Vietnam and hadn't opened in years. Inside were my uniforms, my medals, letters from my unit, photographs of men I'd served with. Some of them were still alive. Most weren't. There was a letter near the bottom, folded and worn, that I'd forgotten about. It was from my father, sent to me in Vietnam in 1969, about 6 months into my first tour. I'd read it once, stuffed it in the footlocker, and never looked at it again. I opened it now. "Dear James," it started. "Your mother insisted I write to you. She says you need to know that we're thinking about you, even though I've been angry about your decision. So here it is. I'm thinking about you. Every day I look at the newspaper and see the casualty lists, and I'm terrified I'll see your name. Every night your mother cries because you're in danger. And every morning I wake up angry at you for putting us through this, and angry at myself for being angry when you're trying to do something you believe in. I don't understand why you couldn't have believed in the business instead. I don't understand why my dreams weren't enough for you, but I'm starting to understand that maybe they didn't have to be. Your mother says I should tell you I'm proud of you. I can't say that yet, but I can say I hope you come home safe, because life without you would be unbearable. Even if you're not the son I planned for, you're the son I have. And that has to mean something. Dad." I read it 3 times. Then I sat there in my basement, surrounded by 45 years of memories, and cried for the first time since my father's funeral. He'd been starting to understand. Back in 1969, in his own clumsy, angry way, he'd been trying to build a bridge across the gap. Even if you're not the son I planned for, you're the son I have, and that has to mean something. But I'd never written back. I'd been too hurt by the first part of the letter, the anger, the disappointment to see the bridge he was offering at the end. And by the time I came home, the gap was already too wide, and we'd spent 40 years standing on opposite sides of it, neither of us quite brave enough to try crossing again. The trust, the inheritance, Caroline's influence, all of that was just the final result of 40 years of distance. My father had died not knowing who I really was, what my life had meant, what I'd built in my own way. And I'd lived 40 years not knowing that he'd carried my boot camp photo in his desk drawer, that he'd written me that letter trying to understand. We'd both made our choices, and we'd both paid for them. I called Preston that night. "I want to invite you and Caroline to dinner, Saturday night. Nothing fancy, just at our house." He sounded wary. "Why?" "Because I don't want to spend the next 40 years the way Dad and I did. Life's too short, and I'm already 65. There was silence. Then, "Okay, we'll be there." Saturday came. Linda made pot roast, like my mother used to make. Preston and Caroline showed up exactly on time, both of them looking uncomfortable in jeans instead of their usual business casual. We had small talk over dinner weather, sports, Caroline's garden, Preston's golf game, normal stuff. The kind of surface conversation my father and I had perfected over decades. Then, over coffee, I pulled out the letter. I found this in my old footlocker. Dad sent it to me in Vietnam in 1969. I'd forgotten about it. I slid it across the table. "Preston, you should read it." He picked it up carefully, like it might break. "Read it slowly." When he finished, his eyes were wet. "He never told me he wrote to you. He never told me he kept my picture in his desk. Apparently there was a lot Dad never told either of us." Preston handed the letter back. "James, about the inheritance. Caroline and I have been talking." "Stop." I held up my hand. "I didn't invite you here to talk about money. Keep it. The company, the properties, all of it. It's yours. You earned it. You spent 30 years building it with Dad. That's your legacy." Caroline spoke up, her voice quiet. "I owe you an apology. I pushed your father to change the trust. I was worried about the company, about Preston's position, but I didn't know you. I didn't know that you might have been reasonable, that we could have worked something out. I just saw a threat to what we'd built. Were you wrong about me?" I asked, genuinely curious. She thought about it. "I don't know. Would you have been okay with 40% of the company going to someone else? Someone who'd never worked there? Probably not, but I would have liked the chance to have that conversation, to be treated like family instead of a liability." Preston set down his coffee cup. We're having that conversation now. Better late than never, right? Right. We talked for another 2 hours. Really talked, maybe for the first time in our lives. Preston told me about the pressure of running the company, of trying to live up to Dad's legacy. Caroline talked about growing up poor and being terrified of losing everything they'd built. I talked about Vietnam, about the things I'd seen and done, about coming home to a father who couldn't look at me without seeing failure. And slowly, carefully, we started building the bridge our father and I never quite managed. Before they left, Preston said, Dad should have left you more. It wasn't right, the way he divided things. Maybe. But he left me something better than money, even if it took me 45 years to find it. What's that? I showed him the letter again. Even if you're not the son I planned for, you're the son I have. And that has to mean something. That's my inheritance. The knowledge that somewhere under all that anger and disappointment, he still thought I meant something. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a check from Preston for $2 million. The note with it said, "This is what 40% would have been worth if Dad had stuck with his original plan. It's not about the company or the properties. It's about you being family. If you want to refuse it, I'll understand. But I hope you won't, because you're my brother, and that has to mean something too. Preston." I showed Linda. She wiped her eyes and smiled. "What are you going to do?" I thought about it for a long time. $2 million, enough to travel, to help our kids, to donate to the veterans organizations I cared about, enough to change our retirement completely. But also, a bridge, an apology, an acknowledgement that I was family, that my choices had value, that I mattered. I called Preston. "I'll accept half. 1 million. The other million stays with you. Use it to set up a scholarship at the company for employees' kids who want to serve in the military. Call it the Richard Thornton Service Scholarship. James, you don't have to. I want to. Dad never understood why I chose to serve. But maybe this way, he can support other people making that same choice. Maybe it's never too late to change the story." Preston was quiet. Then, I think he would have liked that. The scholarship was established a month later. The first recipient was a young woman whose father worked on the factory floor, who wanted to join the Air Force after college. At the ceremony, they put up a plaque with my father's name on it, and underneath, a quote, "Service to country is its own kind of legacy." I stood there looking at that plaque, thinking about my father in his office with my picture in his desk drawer, about that letter he wrote in 1969, about all the years we wasted being angry, when we could have been understanding each other. And I thought about something one of my Vietnam buddies told me once, after a particularly bad firefight. We were sitting in the mud, exhausted and scared, and he said, "You know what the worst casualty of war is? It's not the guys who die. It's about you being family. If you want to refuse it, I'll understand. But I hope you won't, because you're my brother, and that has to mean something too. Preston." I showed Linda. She wiped her eyes and smiled. "What are you going to do?" I thought about it for a long time. $2 million, enough to travel, to help our kids, to donate to the veterans organizations I cared about, enough to change our retirement completely. But also, a bridge, an apology. I've got a comfortable retirement, a good family, and 45 years of perspective on the choices I made. I chose to serve my country when my father wanted me to serve his company. I chose honor over money, duty over dynasty, conscience over comfort. And my father chose to build an empire, to create jobs, to leave a different kind of legacy. Neither of us was wrong. We were just different men with different visions of what a life well lived looked like. The $75,000 check and that handwritten note. You made your choices, I made mine, they stung for a while. But now I understand what he was really saying. Not that my choices were wrong, but that they were mine. That I'd built my own life, separate from his plans. And maybe, in his own complicated way, he'd come to respect that, even if he never quite knew how to say it. I still have that letter from 1969. I framed it and hung it in my office, right next to my Purple Heart and my discharge papers. Even if you're not the son I planned for, you're the son I have, and that has to mean something. It means everything, Dad. It always did. That's my story. Not about fighting for an inheritance or proving my worth or getting revenge on the family that undervalued me. It's about understanding that love and respect can exist even across gaps we never quite figure out how to bridge. It's about recognizing that sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is accepting that we're all doing the best we can with the lives we've chosen. My father left me $75,000 and a note about choices. But he also left me that letter, even if he didn't know I'd find it 45 years later. He left me a brother who was willing to build a bridge when I finally reached out. He left me a company that now helps young people serve their country, even though he never understood why I needed to serve mine. And most importantly, he left me a lesson. It's never too late to change the story. Never too late to build bridges. Never too late to turn inheritance into legacy, misunderstanding into meaning, and distance into connection. I'm 65 years old. I've lived through war and peace, poverty and modest success, anger and forgiveness. I've learned that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property or business empires. It's understanding. It's family. It's the knowledge that even when we make different choices, even when we spend decades on opposite sides of impossible gaps, we still matter to each other. And that, more than any dollar amount, is worth holding on to. Thank you for listening to my story.